Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I'm reading you a book. We are reading Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And things are not going well for the two oldest Bennet girls, Jane and Elizabeth. Both are having trouble in love, even though things looked so promising just a little while ago. Jane, for instance, made an incredibly strong impression on Mr. Bingley, the leaser of Netherfield Hall, and he on her. To everyone watching, and by extension to us, it looked as though they were falling in love with each other, but he is now gone. Perhaps he is being influenced to stay in London, away from Meryton, by his group of friends, his malicious, gossipy sisters, and also his imperious friend, Mr. Darcy. Or perhaps he really is as flighty as he said he was, and just has no plans to return this winter, which is desolating for Jane. She didn't have any pie in the sky dreams about her connection with Mr. Bingley, but she thought there was a connection, and now can't understand it. And when she and Elizabeth talk about it, Elizabeth blames the sisters, that you see the good in everyone, but they aren't actually good people. They're designing malicious harpies who are trying to blacken your name so that they can get their brother to marry Mr. Darcy's sister. Jane refuses to believe it. But at least Elizabeth's anger about the Bingley girls can be soothed a little by her infatuation with Mr. Wickham. An absolutely dreamy addition to Meryton, who's joined the ranks of the Meryton militia, even though he was cut out for a different life. He was originally intended for the clergy, and would have had the living, a very good living, in the let of Mr. Darcy, if Darcy hadn't worked against him. So Darcy's name has been vilified, and just to make sure that we never forget that, Jane Austen brings the narrative of every chapter around to Darcy, even though he's nowhere around and has no idea what's going on in any of these events. He still keeps coming up. And that's where we are now with chapter 26, which is going to have a letter. It's going to have the text of a letter in this chapter, but those of you who might be new to this book, for instance, but who have been with me for our many, many read-alongs of Anthony Trollope, Trollope specializes. He has a handful of specialties. One of them is the fox hunt scene. Another is his letters. He is renowned for how good his letters are, how dramatically they increase the tempo and the life of every chapter that they're in. You're going to find, at least in this instance, that Jane Austen isn't quite as good as that. But let's see what's going on. Because keep in mind, Longbourn, Jane and Elizabeth's house, has been the site of a Christmas visit from Mrs. Bennet's brother and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. They are big favorites of Jane and Elizabeth. Jane and Elizabeth visit them in London all the time. And during this visit, when Mrs. Gardiner is brought up to speed on everything that's going on Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy and Mr. Collins, who's going to marry Charlotte Lucas and have her take over his household, and also with Jane and Mr. Bingley, when Mrs. Gardiner is brought up to speed with all of that, she sits and listens during this Christmas holiday. But at the same time, she's thinking it would probably be good for Jane to get away from here. Not only is this where Mr. Bingley was and is no longer, but this is also where Mrs. Bennet, James' mother, keeps making ham-handed references to Bingley that, unbeknownst to her, are scoring her daughter with pain. Why not get Jane to the city? Go back to the city where the Gardiners live in Gracechurch Street, within sight of their own warehouses. Why not get her there for a change of scenery? And that's what brings us to chapter 26. Mrs. Gardiner's caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given on the first favorable opportunity of speaking to her alone. After honestly telling her what she thought, she went on thus, and her caution is, please don't fall for Mr. Wickham. And the only reason she would give that caution is if Mr. Wickham were gorgeous, if he were a lighthouse of magnetism. You are too sensible a girl, Lizzie, to fall in love merely because you are warned against it, and therefore I am not afraid of speaking openly. Seriously, I would have you be on your guard. Do not involve yourself or endeavor to involve him in an affection which the want of fortune would make so very imprudent. So Mrs. Gardiner is implying that the reason she has against warning Elizabeth about forming a relationship with Mr. Wickham is that Wickham has no money, that he has no fortune of his own. very foretelling of what's coming with Mr. Wickham in this family. I have nothing against him. He is a most interesting young man. And if he had the fortune he ought to have, I should think you could do no better. But as it is, you must not let your fancy run away with you. You have sense, and we all expect you to use it. Your father would depend on your resolution and good conduct, I am sure. You must not disappoint your father. My dear aunt, this is being serious indeed. Yes, and I hope to engage you to be serious likewise. Well then, you need not be under any alarm. I will take care of myself and of Mr. Wickham too. He shall not be in love with me if I can prevent it. Elizabeth, you are not now serious. I beg your pardon. I will try again. At present I am not in love with Mr. Wickham. No, I certainly am not. But he is, beyond all comparison, the most agreeable man I ever saw. Not that I ever spoke to. That I ever saw. And if he becomes really attached to me, I believe it will be better that he should not. I see the imprudence of it. Oh, that abominable Mr. Darcy. There he is again. My father's opinion of me does me the greatest honor, and I should be miserable to forfeit it. My father, however, is partial to Mr. Wickham. In short, my dear aunt, I should be very sorry to be the means of making any of you unhappy, but since we see every day that where there is affection, young people are seldom withheld by immediate want of fortune from entering into engagements with each other, how can I promise to be wiser than so many of my fellow creatures if I am tempted, or how am I even to know what it would be that it would be wisdom to resist? So her mild argument in response to her aunt is, well, plenty of people get married without having a fortune every day. Why should I be any different? Especially if I fall in love. All I can promise you, therefore, is not to be in a hurry. I will not be in a hurry to believe myself his first object. When I am in company with him, I will not be wishing. In short, I will do my best. Perhaps it will be as well if you discourage him coming here so very often. At least you should not remind your mother of inviting him. Little reminder to Elizabeth that she's not the only one who pays attention. Mrs. Gardiner catches her out completely. As I did the other day, says Elizabeth with a conscious smile. Very true. It will be wise in me to refrain from that. But do not imagine that he is always here so often. It is on your account that he has been so frequently invited this week. You know my mother's ideas as to the necessity of constant company for her friends. But really, and upon my honor, I will try to do what I think to be wisest. And now I hope you are satisfied. Her aunt assured her that she was. I doubt very much that she is, but she assured her that she was, and Elizabeth, having thanked her for the kindness of her hints, they parted. A wonderful instance of advice being given on such a point without being resented. Thanks, narrator. Thanks a lot. Mr. Collins returned to Hertfordshire soon after it had been quitted by the Gardiners and Jane. So the Gardiners have left back to London, and they've taken Jane with them. But as he took up his abode with the Lucases this time, his arrival was of no great inconvenience to Mrs. Bennet. His marriage was now fast approaching, and she was at length so far resigned to it as to think it inevitable, even repeatedly to say in an ill-natured tone that she wished they might be happy, meaning she doesn't think they will be. Thursday was to be the wedding day, and on Wednesday Miss Lucas paid her farewell visit, and when she rose to take her leave, Elizabeth, ashamed of her mother's ungracious and reluctant good wishes, and sincerely affected herself, accompanied her out of the room. As they went down the stairs together, Charlotte said, I shall depend on hearing from you very often, Eliza. Keep in mind, these two were best friends. That isn't possible anymore. Thanks to an unguarded slip by Elizabeth, Charlotte knows exactly what Elizabeth thinks of this marriage. And there's no getting around that. There's no way for unforced, natural intimacies to survive when one person knows the other person thinks that about them. That you certainly shall have. And I want another favor to ask. Will you come and see me? We shall often meet, I hope, in Hertfordshire. I am not likely to leave Kent for some time. Promise me, therefore, to come to Hunsford. Elizabeth could not refuse, though she foresaw little pleasure in the visit. My father and Maria are coming to me in March, added Charlotte, and I hope you will consent to be part of the party. Indeed, Eliza, you will be as welcome to me as either of them. Think about this for a minute. Charlotte Lucas has always lived at home. She's never been anywhere else. She's marrying a man she's known for a total of maybe 10 conversations. And he's taking her to another county and into a totally different world to be his wife and to experience what we can assume are her very first sexual experiences. in a totally alien world where she isn't. It's Christmas now. She's not even expecting to see her parents until the spring. It almost makes you sympathetic for Charlotte Lucas. The wedding took place. The bride and bridegroom set off for Kent from the church door, and everybody had as much to say or to hear on the subject as usual. Elizabeth soon heard from her friend, and their correspondence was as regular and frequent as it had ever been. That it should be equally unreserved was impossible. Elizabeth could never address her without feeling that all the comfort of intimacy was over. And though determined not to slacken as a correspondent, it was for the sake of what had been rather than for what was. Charlotte's first letters were received with a good deal of eagerness. They could not but be a curiosity to those who knew how she would speak of her new home, how she would like Lady Catherine, how happy she would dare to pronounce herself to be, though when the letters were read, Elizabeth felt that Charlotte expressed herself on every point exactly as she might have foreseen. She wrote cheerfully, seemed surrounded with comforts, and mentioned nothing which she could not praise. The house, the furniture, the neighborhood, the roads were all to her taste, and Lady Catherine's behavior was most friendly and obliging. It was Mr. Collins's picture of Hunsford and Rosings rationally softened, and Elizabeth perceived that she must wait for her own visit there to know the rest. So the first impressions that Charlotte is giving in her letters are exactly the same as Mr. Collins. Is he watching her write the letters? Is he dictating them to her? Husbands did at this time. They did both at this time. Jane had already written a few lines to her sister to announce their safe arrival in London, and when she wrote again, Elizabeth hoped it would be in her power to say something of the Bingleys, because although it has been, Elizabeth has been assured, Jane has been assured that we live in a completely different part of town. The Gardners live in the commercial district of Gracechurch Street. They live within sight of their own warehouses. There's no chance they're going to run in to Bingley or Darcy or any of that set who are over in Grosvenor Square. They're over in a very wealthy part of town. There's no chance that they are. And Jane seems to believe that, but Elizabeth doesn't. Elizabeth is hoping that they will see each other, that London is a small town. You always run into people that you know. And maybe, it's not stated, but maybe Elizabeth is hoping that somewhere deep inside Jane's totally honest, unscheming heart might be the design of doing that. Maybe that's why you go. Her impatience for this second letter was as well rewarded as impatience generally is. Jane had been a week in town without either seeing or hearing from Caroline, that is, Caroline Bingley. She accounted for it, however, by supposing that her last letter to her friend from Longbourn had by some accident been lost. Because otherwise you tell your friend that you're coming to London and they make arrangements to visit you. My aunt, she continued, is going tomorrow into that part of town, and I shall take the opportunity of calling in Grosvenor Street. She wrote again when the visit was paid, and she had seen Miss Bingley. I did not think Caroline in spirits, were her words, but she was very glad to see me, and reproached me for giving her no notice of my coming to London. I was right, therefore. My last letter had never reached her. I inquired after their brother, of course. He was well, but so much engaged with Mr. Darcy that they scarcely ever saw him. I found that Miss Darcy was expected to dinner. I wish I could see her. My visit was not long, as Caroline and Mrs. Hurst were going out. I dare say I shall see them here soon. In other words, that they'll come to the house of the Gardners. Unfortunately, all of this was fake. All of this was a pose. And unfortunately, our dear Jane, who we want better wishes for her than anyone in this book, is going to become aware of that. Elizabeth shook her head over this letter. It convinced her that accident only could discover Mr. Bingley to her sister's being in town. In other words, Elizabeth is sure that they are avoiding her. 4 weeks passed away, and Jane saw nothing of him. She endeavored to persuade herself that she did not regret it, but she could no longer be blind to Miss Bingley's inattention. After waiting at home every morning for a fortnight, and inventing every evening a fresh excuse for her, the visitor did at last appear, but the shortness of her stay, and yet more the alteration of her manner, would allow Jane to deceive herself no longer. The letter which she wrote on this occasion to her sister will prove what she felt. And then we get the letter, but first, notice how interesting that is. For the first time, the narrative focus actually shifts somewhere else. In fact, away from Elizabeth. It shifts to Jane. We're told what Jane is thinking every morning, what Jane is thinking every night in London. But then we get the letter, and I'm assuming that the letter given in full here is meant to backshadow that description, that Elizabeth is getting all of these realities from these letters. My dearest Lizzie, I am sure will be incapable of triumphing in her better judgment at my expense, when I confess myself to have been entirely deceived in Miss Bingley's regard for me. But, my dear sister, though the event has proved you right, do not think me obstinate if I still assert that, considering what her behaviour was, my confidence was as natural as your suspicion. I do not at all comprehend her reason for wishing to be intimate with me, but if the same circumstance were to happen again, I am sure I would be deceived again. Caroline did not return my visit till yesterday, and not a note, not a line did I receive in the meantime. When she did come, it was very evident that she had no pleasure in it. She made a slight, formal apology for not calling before, said not a word of wishing to see me again, and was in every respect so altered a creature that when she went away, I was perfectly resolved to continue the acquaintance no longer. I pity, though I cannot help blaming her. She was very wrong in singling me out as she did, I can safely say that, but every advance of intimacy began on her side. But I pity her, because she must feel that she had been acting wrong, and because I am very sure that anxiety for her brother is the cause of it. I need not explain myself farther, though we know this anxiety to be quite needless. Yet if she feels it, it will easily account for her behavior to me, and so deservedly dear is he to his sister, whatever anxiety she may feel on his behalf is natural and amiable. I cannot but wonder, however, at her having any such fears now, because if he had at all cared about me, we must have met long, long ago. Here in London, meaning. If he cared about me at all, once he knew I was in London, we would have met. He knows of my being in town, I am certain, for something she said herself, and yet it should seem by her manner of talking as if she wanted to persuade herself that he really is partial to Miss Darcy. I cannot understand it. If I were not afraid of judging harshly, I should almost be tempted to say that there is a strong appearance of duplicity in all this. Oh, Jane, don't ever change. But I will endeavor to banish every painful thought and think only of what will make me happy. Your affection, the invariable kindness of my dear uncle and aunt. Let me hear from you very soon. Miss Bingley said something of his never returning to Netherfield again, of giving up the house, but not with any certainty. We had better not mention it, to Mrs. Bennet, in other words. I am extremely glad that you have such pleasant accounts from our friends at Hunsford. Pray go to see them, with Sir William and Maria. I am sure you will be very comfortable there. This letter gave Elizabeth some pain, but her spirits returned as she considered that Jane would no longer be duped, by the sister, at least. All expectation from the brother was now absolutely over. She would not even wish for any renewal of his attentions. His character sunk on every review of it, and as punishment for him, as well as the possible advantage to Jane, she seriously hoped he might really soon marry Mr. Darcy's sister, as, by Wickham's account, she would make him abundantly regret what he had thrown away. Mrs. Gardiner about this time reminded Elizabeth of her promise concerning that gentleman, in other words, Mr. Wickham, and required information. Elizabeth had such to send as might rather give contentment to her aunt than to herself. His apparent partiality had subsided. His attentions were over. He was the admirer of someone else. Boy, it's rough times for the Bennet girls. Jane has had the blindfold dashed from her eyes. She sees now that the Bingley sisters are conniving. They don't want to know her, and maybe are working on their brother to not know her either. That what other excuse could there be? He knows I'm here. And now, the partiality that gorgeous Mr. Wickham has shown for Jane is over. He's showing partiality to somebody else. And why? The reason why is not a mystery. Elizabeth was watchful enough to see it all, but she could see it and write of it without material pain. Her heart had been but slightly touched, and her vanity was satisfied with believing that she would have been his only choice had fortune permitted it. The sudden acquisition of £10,000 was the most remarkable charm of a young lady to whom he was now rendering himself agreeable. A young lady in the neighborhood has suddenly come into £10,000. That's a lot. That's a lot of money. That will set, if you're not a spendthrift or a wastrel, that will set you up for life. But Elizabeth, less clear-sighted perhaps in his case than in Charlotte's, did not quarrel with him for his wish of independence. Nothing, on the contrary, could be more natural. And while able to suppose that it cost him a few struggles to relinquish her, She was ready to allow it was wise and desirable measure for both, and could very sincerely wish him happy. In other words, Elizabeth criticized Charlotte for making this exact same decision. Charlotte Lucas was not a love-struck fool. You couldn't be love-struck with Mr. Collins. She saw what he was, but she also saw what he offered. Connections to a powerful patroness, a comfortable living, a comfortable house, security, a place in society, the likelihood of inheriting Longbourn. And she made that choice. Hating matrimony and hating men, knowing exactly what she was doing, she made that choice. And before Elizabeth could guard her tongue, she was appalled out loud to Charlotte at that choice. Here, Mr. Wickham is making the exact same choice. There's no love here. I don't know this young woman with £10,000, but I have to go where my fortune is. I have to make a practical choice. All this was acknowledged to Mrs. Gardiner, and after relating the circumstances, she went on thus. I am now convinced, my dear aunt, that I have never been much in love. For had I really experienced that pure and elevating passion, I should present detest his very name and wish him all manner of evil. I never understand why authors and poets talk about being in love as opposed to loving someone. Talk about being in love as, what was it again? A pure and elevating passion. It's hell. Absolute hell. But my feelings are not only cordial towards him, they are even impartial towards Miss King. Miss King is the name of the young woman who suddenly came into £10,000 and is now the object of that dreamy Mr. Wickham's attention, because he wants her money. We don't know anything about this Miss King, but we know that at least. That she suddenly came into £10,000 and suddenly was his paramour. We don't know what she looks like. Is he making a huge sacrifice to hold her hand or to pay attention to her after church? We don't know. I cannot find out that I hate her at all, or that I am in the least unwilling to think her a very good sort of girl. There can be no love in all this. My watchfulness has been effectual, and though I should certainly be a more interesting object to all my acquaintance were I distractedly in love with him, I cannot say that I regret my comparative insignificance. Importance may sometimes be purchased too dearly. Kitty and Lydia take his defection much more to heart than I do. They are young in the ways of the world, and not yet open to the mortifying conviction that handsome young men must have something to live on, as well as the plain. One of those two young girls is going to find that out very immediately. But there you have it. That is the end of this chapter. Things don't look good at all. Jane, even as well-tempered as she is towards other people, is now certain that the Bingley girls don't like her, that maybe they never have liked her, that they don't want to know her when she's in London, and maybe in her darkest hours she's allowing herself to agree with Elizabeth that in addition to all that, they're keeping Bingley from her, or poisoning his mind against her. And at the same time, this lovely, lovely boy in his bright uniform who's paying Elizabeth so much attention has dropped her for someone with £10,000. And that's this chapter. Pretty grim tidings for the Bennet girls. Oh, no. How on earth can we pry a happy ending out of any of this? Well, it's a long way off. So we'll see what happens next. But a lot has happened now. Charlotte Lucas is married and gone. Mrs. Bennet is slightly reconciled to it. Not really, but slightly. Jane has left the neighborhood for London. Elizabeth has been jilted. Quite a bit has happened. It's all just happened in a very small scale, little parlor way. But we'll move on from here next time. Thank you, BookTube.